Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to my video about Joe Biden's first term in the Senate. We all know who Joe Biden is. Today, he's mostly remembered for his vice presidency under Barack Obama from 2008 to 2016, as well as his own presidency from 2020 to 2024. This is when Joe was at his oldest, and some might say weakest mentally. Despite that, he did pass the most legislation in a single term since President LBJ, and that was with a divided Congress, no less. The man is of many flaws, but there's just something charming about old Uncle Joe. So let's go back in time to when he was at his youngest and most energetic self. Back in the 1970s, a time of scandals, war in Vietnam, and racial violence and desegregation. Where did Joe Biden lay in this time? What was he like? How was he different from the sleepy Joe we know today? Let me clarify. This video, as I mentioned, is only about Joe Biden's first term in the Senate. If you would like to know more about his Senate years, let me know. I could also make a video about his attempted presidential run in 1988 and how that derailed real quick. Here's a quote from Joe Biden to start us off with. If you need more than 10 rounds to hunt, and some argue they hunt with that many rounds, you shouldn't be hunting. If you can't get the deer in 3 shots, you shouldn't be hunting. You're an embarrassment. Right, so let me give you all just a little bit of background about our character here. Joe was born on November 20th, 1942, Scranton, Pennsylvania, not Delaware. His family was of Irish Catholic ancestry and were actively practicing Catholics. His family were also pretty well off at first, but after a few bad business ventures by his father, the Bidens would find themselves becoming a working-class family. His family would eventually move from Scranton, Pennsylvania to Claymont, Delaware in 1953, where Joe would grow up mostly in Delaware, known as the kid with the stutter, but he was also a little bit of a daredevil in his youth. Joe eventually graduated from the University of Delaware in 1965 and would go on to attend law school at the University of Syracuse up in New York, graduating in 1968. Joe was very interested in law, of course, having just graduated from law school. He would go to pass Delaware bar just a year later in 1969. Biden would practice in accounting in Wilmington, becoming a corporate law lawyer, defending a big business, but Joe didn't feel like he was helping the people he knew best, working-class folk. So he would eventually switch practices, becoming a public defender. His clients were at this time mostly African Americans. This would help build his good relations with the African American communities when he would eventually decide to run for office. Now, in 1970, Biden would get his start in politics. With the campaign mostly run by family and friends, he would, at the age of 27, run for the position of New Castle County, which was the 4th district of Delaware. He would win that race, serving 2 years as a councilman, where he focused on fighting big corporations and their highway projects that would hurt local communities by destroying neighborhoods, as well as pushing back oil tycoons that tried to build refineries on the coast of Delaware. Some of Biden's accomplishments was creating a countywide property fat tax exemption for residents over the age of 65. He was also in favor of housing, commercial real estate, sanitary sewers, and storm management system, as well as public transportation, particularly the Amtrak. I should by now mention Biden's family at this time. He was married with his first wife, Neela, with 2 sons, Hunter and Beau. By 1971, he would have his first daughter, Naomi. Biden was close to his family, as they helped him achieve his highest aspirations and were the center of his life. Joe Biden also had his brother Jimmy and close family friends supporting him. Now at age 29, Biden had a choice. His seat was redistricted in favor of a Republican candidate. There was little chance he would win a 3rd term as a councilman. The governorship race had no Democratic contender, as they don't want to be slaughtered by well-respected and liked Republican Senator Caleb J. Boggs. So Biden, seeing these 2 races, realized if either was going to be a long shot anyways, he might as well aim for the moon so he might fall in the stars. With that, the stage is set between 2 men. A witty young Democrat, way out of his league, and an old folksy incumbent Republican senator. Now it's time for some background on Biden's opponent, Caleb J. Boggs. Boggs, at this time, had already served Delaware for 2 terms. He was a moderate Republican, refusing to pander to culture war talking points. Instead, he was a big business Republican, which allowed him to do well in a blue state of Delaware. The problem, however, was that the senator didn't actually want to run for a 3rd term. The 63-year-old senator had to be convinced by the president himself, that being Richard Nixon, to stay in the race. That was to prevent a destructive primary that the RNC, Republican National Committee, believed would only divide the party more in that state. So with that, he went into the race with old dad vibes that we would usually associate with Biden of today, and believed that the governorship belonged to him, as he was the incumbent and the established candidate with more experience. He faced little resistance from the mayor of Wilmington and Representative Pete DuPont, who respectively bowed out at Nixon's request. Now onto the actual campaign. The national election campaign was well underway in 1972 as well. And Nixon was running for re-election against Democratic challenger George McGovern. McGovern, however, was a weak Democrat painted as a radical liberal. Biden made sure to distance himself from the Democratic presidential nominee, now not allowing him to be tied to McGovern's sinking campaign. He's quoted as saying, "When it comes to civil rights and civil liberties, I'm a liberal, but that's it. I'm really quite conservative on most other issues." Leading in a July 1972 column in the Morning News, Eleanor Shaw wrote in an article, "This November you can vote either for the oldest young Democrat or the youngest old Republican." Biden's campaign was focused on portraying himself as in touch with the issues of the day and being the candidate of the next generation. As earlier mentioned, he decided to run on a moderate tone, so it was impressive that he was able to drive out young college and high school students to vote for him, as they were mostly liberal. High school students would even set up a high school Biden club, creating a Biden post office. These young volunteers were inspired by Biden's oratory skill in his youth. The youth were very important to Biden, as this was the first election where 18-year-olds would be allowed to vote in. Young volunteers also bolstered his campaign outreach, as resources for his campaign were very limited. These students also came home to their parents and family, often bringing out politics and potentially swaying their family's opinions towards the Biden camp. Biden's campaign was managed by his sister Valerie and his brother Jimmy, who was the chief fundraiser. Patrick Goodell was also on board as a political pollster and advisor to the campaign. On the ground level, Joe's wife Neela would go door-to-door campaigning with him. Joe would utilize coffee meet and greets and meeting directly with voters. This was because he was tight on budget, as previously mentioned. However, he was able to afford some advertisements in the newspapers. These ads were mostly on the tax, trying to convey Biden's youth and knowing the issues. For example, to Caleb Boggs, an unfair tax was the 1948 poll tax. To Joe Biden, an unfair tax is 1972 income tax. Joe ironically would play into the dad vibes that Boggs gave off, treating him as a man of good character, but just past his time. This allowed him to go on the offensive with his ads and the campaign, while also appearing overall positive to voters. The policies Biden campaigned on were withdrawal from Vietnam, mass transit, environmental protection, protecting Social Security right in the Newcastle Correction Institute, closing corporate loopholes and income and consumer protection, as well as continued advancement of civil rights and desegregation. However, he refused to support busing, which at the time was deeply unpopular with most Americans. But in retrospect seems to be a stain on Biden's record, making him out to be more moderate on the issue during the time period, but by no means was he a racist. And in a conversation with an actual racist, where a racist proceeded to say, after Joe Biden voiced his opinion for continued desegregation and further civil rights. "You N-word lover, you want them living next to you?" And Biden responded with his usual wit, stating, "If you're the alternative, I guess the answer is yes." Now, the campaign had only a budget of $150,000. Biden, to meet the funds needed, would end up taking on a second mortgage on his house. In the end, he would spend $300,000 on the election. To further highlight the long shot of his chances of winning, a poll conducted in the summer of the election saw him losing by almost 30%. But in the end, Biden was able to close the gap. He was just too energetic, and he had the passion to win the race. Meanwhile, Boggs didn't even want to run to begin with. Biden saying that he saw no twinkle in his eyes anymore, that his heart just wasn't in it. Biden's youth would turn out the new generation just enough for him to clutch the general election and be elected as the 6th youngest senator in American history. On November 7th, the margins were close. 3,000 votes for Caleb and 3,162 votes for Biden. Delaware went handily to Nixon, as did most of the country in this election cycle for the national election. Now, it was a stunning upset for the younger county councilman. The funniest part was that Joe wasn't even old enough to be sworn in right away. Needing to be at least 30 years old, he was only 29. Biden had to wait an entire month until he would be old enough to take the oath of office. But even before Joe could fully enjoy the taste of victory, tragedy struck. It was close, personal, and brutal. It was December 18th, 1972. His wife Neela has just gone out with the kids for Christmas shopping. Christmas was just a week away when she would get into a terrible car crash, which ultimately take her life, as well as her daughters, and leave 2 badly injured sons, Beau and Hunter. They were taken to the hospital soon after. Joe Biden, meanwhile, was in his Senate office getting ready. It was a rather small office, and his sister Valerie was helping him out. She would be the one to break the tragic news to Biden. He knew right away what happened. The night before, his wife said things were just too good, and felt as something terrible was just around the corner. Tragically, she was right. Biden wasn't in the mood for politics anymore. He was just too far into grief. So far, in fact, that he thought about quitting and leaving his Senate seat. But he was convinced by Senator Majority Leader Mike Mansfield to stay on and was promised valuable committee assignments. Even people across the aisle consoled the young senator. The Kennedys even invited him to dinners as they were able to relate to his grief. Nixon even called after he heard the news and offered his words of comfort to the young senator, which is a bit funny with how their relationship would develop. But he made it clear that if he couldn't be an effective father for his kids at the same time as being a senator, he would resign, displaying his commitment to family first. Luckily, Joe Biden was able to balance the two of being a father and a senator for the United States, and would continue, of course, in that position. On January 3rd, 1972, he would take the oath in the same hospital where his sons were laid recovering from the crash. That's how Joe Biden started his major political career, through a hopeful long-shot campaign and tragedy of his wife's and daughter's death. Joe Biden, unlike today, was admired by the press. He was a young senator and a JFK-like figure. Biden was pounded by the media, young female magazines searching for stories of the now single senator. Joe himself was worried about not being taken seriously by elder senators and even called in favor of age term limits, which is ironic now, because he later became on to be one of the oldest presidents in American history. Even famed Secretary of State Henry Kissinger even mistakenly believed he was a young aide staffer instead of a United States senator. Again, he was seen as a celeb. He was the next generation. He gave hope to the young and was their inspirations. Times even named him one of the 200 faces for the future. How could he not be? His classic smirk warmed hearts, and his laugh cheered those even in the darkest despair. He was only 30, and it made all the difference. Biden of today is old and slow, still with the same smirk, but now it seems like Biden said to Caleb, the twinkle in his eyes is just gone. But yet I still can't help but feel charmed. His Grand Joe felt like a real man to me. He was prone to gaffes as he grew, which made him even more relatable. In those early days, however, he kept to himself. Biden rode the Amtrak every day from Wilmington to Washington. I think that says a lot about him, that he rode to work like everybody else in the public transit he invested in. There was a reason why, when Joe Biden entered the Senate, he was one of the poorest senators. With all that said, it's time to actually get to the reason why this video was made in the first place. What exactly did Joe Biden achieve and do in his first term in the Senate? This was the real challenge, as the United States Congress records are a pain to look through, especially so long ago. Joe Biden's first term was from 1972 to 1978, so it's hard to find everything. If I missed anything or got something wrong, I apologize. I tried my best, so let's finally get into it. Two main things to keep in mind. The president is Richard Nixon, and the war in Vietnam was still raging. The American people are angry, and they want change. So how did Biden address these issues and other concerns of the public during the chaotic years that were the 70s? Joe would continue to fight for withdrawal from the Vietnam War until the peace accords in 1973. In 1974, Watergate was really breaking out. The year prior, the vice president, Spiro Agnew, had to resign on his own corruption charges of bribery. Nixon had the burner under him, and Biden was a part of the flame. Calling out Nixon's violations of public trust and abuse of powers of the presidency, this outrage would later fuel the creation of the Ethics of Government Act of 1978, which, of course, Biden supported. Now, back to Nixon. He would, of course, later resign that same year, making new Vice President Gerald F. Ford president. When Ford would pardon Nixon, Biden heavily criticized and called Ford out for it. Like most of his party and some across the aisle, he was outraged of Ford's pardoning of Nixon and for Nixon not paying due for his crimes as president and not being able to be impeached. Policy-wise, Biden co-sponsored the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, which became law in September of 1973, the same year, which gave more rights for those who are disabled and which ordered non-discrimination of those who are disabled in regards to hiring. Joe would also continue to fight against big business like he did as a councilman of Wilmington. This was through the Consumer Lending Act of 1975, which he sponsored, and it became law in March year of 1976. Biden continued his fight against inequality the same year with the Equal Credit Opportunity Act amendments, which expanded the credit to those who were recipients of the public assistance programs, which also became law in March 1976. Two bills that were sponsored by Biden was the Regulatory Agency Responsibility Act in 1975, which would have brought reform to multiple government agencies. The second act was the Federal Oil Pollution Liability Act the same year, which of course would protect the environment and hold companies and government responsible for hurting it. Both of these bills, however, died. Now we come to the controversial part of Biden's Senate career. Some might say Biden's biggest stain. A bleak and dark spot on his civil rights record. His vicious fight against busing, which again at this time was deeply unpopular amongst the majority of the American people. First, you have to understand the government had set up a program named HEW, or HEW, Health Educational Welfare, as it stands for. And now, in 1976, Senator Byrd would add an amendment to the HEW appropriations. This amendment would bar federal funding towards HEW's busing desegregation effort. Joe, who fought for African Americans as a public defender and called for the desegregation of schools, would vote in favor. And that's just the start of his crusade. Inspired, Biden would attempt his own Biden amendment to the HEW appropriations in 1977, which would block the HEW from assigning teachers and students by race. However, it would be rejected by the Senate. Yet, he didn't give up. Later that same year, Joe would co-sponsor an amendment bill with help from Senator Roth. This legislation would bar courts from ordering busing unless discriminatory intent was the motivating factor of segregation. It was reported to the Senate Judiciary Committee, but after a long fight, it was tabled and defeated in 1978. Again, this didn't make Biden give up. Say what you want about the issue. He was definitely in the wrong. Biden, once set on a goal, was stubborn as hell. Later in 1978, Biden worked with Eagleton, co-sponsoring another amendment to the HEW appropriations, the Biden-Eagleton Amendment, which would be named, specifically block all federal funding for HEW's usage of busing and other methods of desegregation, which crippled the program, destroying mandatory busing as a form of integration. This amendment passed through the Senate, finally giving Biden his victory over what he saw as a racist policy at the time. Well, now that's all I could find on Biden's record in the Senate during his first term, which makes sense since it was his first major political office. He was probably, very new to the works of the Senate, and it's probably why you could find so little. And me, in the grand scheme of things, did not do a lot when he was elected for his first term, at least in the Senate. So, in conclusion, Joe Biden back then was a different animal. With a few quirks he still keeps to this day. Back then he was full of youth and a fresh face. Back in the 70s he was a long-shot candidate, fighting against the establishment. Now in his old age he's considered the very establishment he fought back then. Scranton Joe was a flawed man fighting against busing, but at the same time supporting anti-discrimination policies, fighting for working-class folk, just like his family all those years ago who lost their prestige and had a battle to get anything. Sticking up against corporations that didn't pay their fair share or abused their consumers. Joe would fight corruption in government, calling out Nixon's crimes in the White House. But that was all in the past. No longer the Bachelor of Senate, Biden's more quiet now, like he was at the beginning of his political career, away from public eye. He's an old man with many regrets and failures, but also success and triumph. But personally, I just think he's a funny old guy, who keeps it real and will always be a president, and a good one at that. Well, here we are at the end. I hope you enjoyed the video to some extent at least. Let me know your opinions in the comments. Tell me if you would like more videos like this. Now, I'll leave you with one more quote to finish this off from Joseph Robinette Biden Jr. No fundamental social change occurs merely because the government acts. It's because civil society, the conscience of a country, begins to rise up and demand change. Well, that's all. Thanks for watching Biden Nights.